Hello, I'm Dr. Q. We discuss economic growth in this video. Economists define and measure economic growth in two different ways. The first is an increase in real GDP over some time period, and the second is an increase in real GDP per capita over some time period. It is typically measured as a percentage rate of growth, either on a quarterly or yearly basis. During periods of recession, the growth rate will be negative instead of positive. Whether the first or second measure of determining growth is used depends on the circumstances. Looking at the GDP per capita allows one to compare countries of different sizes. For country-to-country comparisons, real GDP is more useful. Generally speaking, GDP growth is considered an economic goal. The expansion of total output relative to population results in higher standards of living. It lessens the burden of scarcity. If we want to know how many years our GDP will double, we use the rule of 70, which means we use 70 divided by the annual percentage rate of growth. If the growth rate is 3.5%, then 70 divided by 3.5, it takes 20 years for the GDP to double. If the growth rate is 2%, then 70 divided by 2, it takes 35 years for the GDP to double. During the years 1950 to 2015, the United States real GDP on average grew 3.1% per year, and the real GDP increased more than sevenfold. The real GDP per capita grew about 2% annually, and the real GDP per capita increased more than threefold. While both real GDP and real GDP per capita have increased over the past about 6 decades, this must be qualified in several ways. Because the numbers do not fully account for improvements in products and services, they tend to understate the growth of economic well-being. They also do not consider that growth has occurred at the same time that there has been an increase in the amount of leisure time, so economic well-being is even further understated. The numbers fail to account for any environmental or quality of life impacts as well. This table presents the growth in real GDP and real GDP per capita in the United States since 1950. Due to the population increase, real GDP per capita has increased at a slower pace than real GDP. Since the population has doubled, the rate of increase in real GDP per capita has been about half that of real GDP. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, living standards were basically stagnant for long periods of time. Since then, however, modern economic growth has been characterized by sustained and ongoing increases in the standard of living. This growth has dramatically affected cultural, social, and political arrangements. Countries experiencing modern economic growth have tended to move toward democratic forms of government, people's lifespans have doubled, and ordinary people have been able to experience leisure time and the arts due to increased wealth and living standards. Modern economic growth has slowly spread from its British birthplace. While much of the Western world began to experience growth in the early 1800s, most of Asia did not experience it until the early 1900s. In the last few decades, nations in Africa have only begun to see modern economic growth. These discrepancies in growth rates have led to a great difference between the wealth of nations that have experienced modern economic growth and those that have not. Thanks to technology diffusion, those poorer nations can catch up. Developing economies can grow faster than the developed ones because of a catch-up. This table shows the real GDP per capita in 1960 and 2010 plus the average annual growth rates of real GDP per capita from 1960 to 2010 for selected countries. Note the vast differences in growth rates. The nations from Asia have experienced much higher growth rates since they're in a catch-up mode, while those countries experiencing modern economic growth for a longer time frame have lower rates. This graph illustrates the large differences in the standards of living across nations. Before modern economic growth, the standards of living were much more equal. But with nations experiencing modern economic growth at different times, the standards of living vary greatly. There are several institutional structures that promote and sustain modern economic growth. Property rights are essential as people will not invest if they believe their investments are not safe from theft or an unscrupulous government. Patent and copyright laws are also necessary if a society wants a constant flow of innovative new technologies and sophisticated new ideas. Efficient financial institutions, literacy and education, free trade, and a competitive market system are other key factors in ensuring a nation's ability to sustain growth. However, the patent system has its issues. It prevents destructive creation, which means technological advancement is easier and more feasible when standing on the shoulders of giants. Patents prevent technology diffusion and hinder improvement in certain ways. Besides, there are patent trolls and cyber squatting patents. This does not help with economic growth. Several of the determinants of growth relate to the physical ability of the economy to expand. Any increases or improvements in these supply factors will increase the potential size of an economy's GDP. The fifth determinant of economic growth is the demand factor. To achieve the higher production potential created by the supply factors, households, businesses, and the government must also expand their purchases of goods and services. The sixth factor, efficiency, involves the issue that the economy must achieve economic efficiency as well as full employment. It must use its resources in the least costly way to provide the specific mix of goods and services that maximizes people's well-being. This is the micro way of explaining the growth, expansion of production possibilities. Society can increase its real output and income in one of two ways. One, by increasing its inputs of resources, and two, by raising the productivity of those inputs. By focusing on the labor input, we can build a framework for discussing the role of supply factors in growth. In this illustration, a nation's economic growth from one year to the next depends on its increase in labor inputs and its increase in labor productivity. By looking at these numbers, it is clear that both increases in the quantity of labor and increases in labor productivity are important sources of economic growth. Between 1953 and 2015, the labor force increased from 63 million to 158 million workers. Productivity growth has usually been the more significant factor. Five factors, when combined, appear to explain changes in productivity growth rates. The largest contributor is technological advancement, which accounts for approximately 40% of productivity growth. The discovery of new knowledge generates it. The quantity of capital explains roughly 30% of productivity growth. More and better plants and equipment make workers more productive. Education and training, economies of scale, and resource allocation account for the remaining productivity growth. Investment in human capital is an important means of increasing labor productivity. By 2015, 88% of the US population had at least a high school education, and 33% had a college or post-secondary education, both representing substantial increases over the past several decades. Economies of scale are the reductions in per unit production costs resulting from increased firm size and output levels. Improved resource allocation means workers over time have moved from low to high productivity employment. The long-run movement toward liberalized international trade through international agreements has improved the allocation of resources, increased labor productivity, and expanded real output, both here and abroad. The test performance of the U.S. 8th grade students did not compare favorably with that of 8th graders in several other nations. In the 4th International Math and Science Study 2011. In mathematics, the United States came in 9th, and science 10th. As measured by changes in the index of labor productivity, the growth rate doubled from 1995 to 2012 compared to 1973 to 1995. Economists relate the increase to the significant wave of new technology and global competition. The increase in productivity growth is important as real output, real income, and real wages are all linked to it. It is the main route for improving the standards of living for a nation's workers. So, what are some of the reasons for the increased productivity growth? A core element was the explosion of entrepreneurial ability and innovation based on the development of the microchip. Microchips have found their way into thousands of products and changed business operations. Hundreds of new startup firms aided in the advancement of new information technology. These new firms took advantage of increasing returns and economies of scale as they helped to increase labor productivity. Global competition fueled by the collapse of the socialist economies was another key factor in the increasing rate of labor productivity growth. This graph reflects the growth in the United States productivity between 1973 and 2015. Average productivity was 1.5% until 1995. But after 1995, the average productivity growth rate increased to 2.4%, decreasing to just 0.4% per year after the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. It is not clear why productivity rates have slowed. The growth seen in 1995 to 2010 was anomaly brought about by the information technology revolution. Still, that alone would not explain why rates have dropped below the pre-revolution growth rates. Several explanations have been offered to explain this change. The first is that the high debt levels accumulated by individuals and firms before the Great Recession may be to blame. Another explanation is that an excess of capacity exists, which makes firms reluctant to purchase newer, more productive equipment. Many new technology-based products are being created and offered free to consumers, so they're not measured in GDP. And finally, technological progress may stall, meaning growth will stagnate until invention and innovation speed up again. The global perspective lists the top 10 countries based on the Global Competitiveness Index. The index uses factors like innovativeness, the capability to transfer technology among sectors, efficiency of the financial system, rates of investment, and the degree of integration with the rest of the world. While most economists usually agree that economic growth is desirable and sustainable, not everyone agrees. Critics say industrialization and growth comes with pollution, climate change, ozone depletion, and other environmental problems. They also argue that little compelling evidence exists that economic growth has solved sociological problems such as poverty, homelessness, and discrimination. While growth has led to higher living standards, it does not necessarily translate to a better life. There is also concern about whether the growth is sustainable. The Earth has limited resources which are being consumed at alarming rates. Growth proponents meet all the criticism's arguments with the upside of the situation. They point to higher education levels, increased recreation, better access to medical care, and other benefits of modern society. They feel that environmental concerns can be dealt with as technology advances. The automobile industry illustrates that very issue with the movements towards vehicles that use alternative fuels rather than limited fossil fuels. As nations shift from agriculture to industry, fertility levels plummet and birth rates fall dramatically. So the labor force is shrinking while the population swells, resulting in each generation being smaller than the one before. This trend is known as the inverse dependency ratio. If productivity does not keep up with the fall of this ratio, some economists believe that living standards will decline. The first place where this problem will appear is Social Security. There may also be less innovation and slower productivity growth. Other economists are more hopeful and believe that productivity growth and living standards could keep on rising at the rates we have come to expect. That's all for the video. Thank you for watching.